And so you are going to be needing to know this diagram for the quiz next Wednesday. So you want to make sure that you study this diagram. When we look at the first layer of the skin, you'll notice that it is relatively thin compared to the other layer. And this thin layer is called the epidermis. So if we look at the outer layer of the skin and we look at what this means, so epi means upon the dermis. So the dermis is the underlying layer. And so this is the outer layer of the skin. And it is composed of epithelial tissue. What type of epithelial tissue? Stratified squamous. So it's many layers of flattened cells. Now, the dermis is the inner layer, and the dermis is composed of connective tissue. And then underneath the dermis is what is referred to as the hypodermis. And what do you think the hypodermis is composed of primarily? What is the type of tissue that's underneath our skin? It is a connective tissue, but what do we have underneath our skin as mammals? Adipose tissue. So this is mainly adipose tissue. Okay. So adipose tissue would be subcutaneous fat. And that actually helps to connect the skin to the muscles. So there is also areolar tissue here. So this is called the superficial fascia. And there's a real interest in fascia these days because we're realizing how important it is. This is what connects like the skin to the muscles, but there's also more deep fascia around each of the muscle bundles. And there's some people that have problems with pain associated with their fascia. And does anybody know what that is sometimes referred to as? If you have pain kind of chronically throughout your body, and they believe it has to do with something with your fascia, what is that called? Fibromyalgia, right? So fibro. Okay. Okay. So if we look at the epidermis, it actually has the layers, and the innermost layer is what gives rise to the cells that are constantly, innermost layer, it gives rise to the cells that are constantly replacing the outer epidermis. So this is what is referred to as the stratum basal. And in general, this is just a single layer of cells that undergo mitosis, and the cells divide in two. And one cell starts to migrate up and become the epidermis, and the other cell resides inside the stratum basal and becomes a stem cell. And so this is cells that undergo mitosis. So remember that mitosis is just simply a type of cell division where one cell divides into two. From that layer, we have what is called from this layer going from innermost to outermost, we have what is called the stratum spinosum. And spinosum, that's a SP, refers to the fact that these cells under the microscope, they look spiny. And the reason why they look spiny is that they have desmosomes that connect one another. So they have desmosomes connecting the cells. And the desmosomes are formed from keratin. So keratin is another example of a structural protein like collagen, but in our skin and our hair and our nails, we don't have the collagen in the outermost surface of the skin, but we have keratin. So that is a structural protein. Then we have this is not bending like I want it to. Let's see, did somebody lock it in place? That's why my handwriting is kind of awkward. There we go. Okay, so the next layer is called the stratum granulosum. And so granules refer to the fact that these cells are going to be secreting substances. So they're going to produce vesicles filled with glycolipids, and glycolipids is what makes the skin waterproof. So this produces granules of glycolipids. And this also starts to produce abundant keratin inside the cell. And then the outermost layer of the skin is called the stratum corneum. So think corn, like hard, right? So this is the outermost hard layer. And this is a really interesting layer because this is dead cells. And they lack nuclei. And they're filled with keratin. So your outermost skin consists of dead cells, and the reason why would be dead cells is that these form layers that are protective, that are constantly slept off. And the other thing is that there's not very many nutrients that are coming up from the dermis. So the epithelial, the epidermis, doesn't have its own vascularization. You don't have blood vessels in the epidermis. So the epidermis lacks blood vessels. So it is said to be avascular. So A means without, vascular would be blood vessels. And so the blood vessels that you have are actually in your dermis. They're not in the epidermis. And so nutrients just simply have to diffuse from the dermis into the epidermis. And then by the time it gets through to the outer layer, nutrients can't diffuse that far, and so the cells will die. And then they get rid of their nucleus and they just fill themselves with keratin. Okay, so if we look at a diagram of these different layers, this is in your book. This is showing a microscope view, and this is just a diagram. So here you see the basal layer, and in the basal layer, that is where we have the melanocytes. So we talked about the importance of the melanocytes producing melanin to protect against UV radiation. This is the stratum spinosum right here, the stratum granulosum, and in the granulosum, you can actually see that these cells have a nucleus, and then they have all these little vesicles in them that are going to produce the glycolipids. And then this outer layer is the corneum. In some of your skin where you have calluses, there is another part of the corneum, which is called the stratum lucidium. And you don't need to know that, but lucidium means that it is clear colored. And so like on the bottoms of your feet where your skin kind of looks like you can see through it, that would be a thicker part of the stratum corneum called the stratum lucidium. So if we look at a disease that is, actually, we'll talk about the dermis first. So if we look at the dermis, there's actually two layers to the dermis that you need to know. The first outermost layer is called the papillary layer. And this connects to the epidermis. And papillae are nipple-like structures. And so these kind of have these invaginations into the epidermis that kind of look like this. So this layer has these invaginations. And it is a thin layer. So it is thin. And it is made of areolar connective tissue. The inner thicker layer is called the reticular layer. And this is composed of dense connective tissue. With lots of fibers. So collagen fibers. And reticular, remember it means a network. So there's other types of tissues in here. So this is where we have nervous tissue and blood vessels. And glands. So these are all in the dermis. When we think about animals and their skin, this is actually what we would refer to as the leather. So if you've ever tried to skin and then tan the hide of an animal, you know that you have to dry it out, but you also have to scrape it. And so when you're scraping the leather, what you're doing is you're scraping the epidermis off. And then underneath that is the strong leather, which is made of that collagen and those connective fibers that are interwoven together and that are very, very strong. Okay, so if we look at a picture of this, so here, this would be the epidermis right here. So this is the outermost layer. And why do you think that the basal layer is dark color? What are the types of cells that are in this dark color? So this is the basal layer right here. Melanocytes, right? So the melanocytes are there. And then we can see this papillary layer. So notice that the papillary layer extends up like this, right? And then the thick dermis is full of these fibers. Particular layer of the dermis versus the papillary layer. Notice how many more fibers they are located in that particular area. Now, it's very important that we don't have a separation of the epidermis and the dermis. So sometimes you can separate them when you get blisters. So a blister is where you get fluid underneath the epidermis. So that is due to excessive friction on the surface of the skin, and that destroys the connection between the epidermis and the dermis. There is also a genetic disease that leads to blistering and sores, which is called epidermolysis bulbosus. And I mentioned this before. This is the butterfly children. Because in butterflies, the scales rub off very readily on the butterfly wings. And in the children with the epidermolysis bulbosus, their skin actually will rub off. And there's different degrees of severity of this. So there's a couple of different genetic abnormalities that are related to this. And so this would be an example. Oh, did I spell that wrong? Let me see. Bulbosa. Did I put bulbosa? I did. Sorry, bulbosa. Sorry. Bulbosa. So there's a couple of examples of this would probably be maybe a less severe kind, but you can see that they, even with the slightest touch, their skin starts to, their epidermis starts to come away from their dermis, and eventually it leads to infections, and so then they might have to have amputations, for example. And so they don't really have a cure for this particular disease, but it just shows how significant the connection between the different layers of the skin is. Because when it doesn't work, then it's very, very bad. Yes, and so this is just genetic. Yep. So there are different mutations. It's a series of different mutations that control for the formation of those desmosomes. So the desmosome connections do not work properly. And then you get that sloughing of the skin. Okay, the other interesting thing about our skin is that it has ridges. And so if you think about the papilla, in some parts of our body, the papilla, the papillary of the dermis, it kind of produces these ridges. And on the fingertips, the ridges are thought to increase our ability to hold on to stuff, and specifically when we sweat. And so you'll notice that each of these ridges has on it little openings of sweat glands. And so when your fingers are sweaty, supposedly you're able to hold on things better than if they're not sweaty, right? And so this is the reason why we leave fingerprints everywhere, is because we have these sweat glands on our ridges. So when we touch something, it leaves the pattern behind. There's another interesting thing about the dermis is that the collagen fibers tend to run in a particular line in the dermis. And this is just a diagram that shows that. And this is significant for when you're going to create an opening in the body, as if you're going to like do a surgical procedure. So like if you're going to do a surgical procedure in the neck, you would not cut like this to open it up, right? So what you would do is you would cut with the lines in order to open that up, because it is more likely to heal and to come back together again if you cut with the lines of the collagen fibers instead of against them. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about skin color. So we have melanin as a pigment. That protects against UV radiation. We also have some examples of being able to see different symptoms in the body based upon the skin color. So for example, we have cyanosis. And does anybody know what cyanosis means? What is the color of your skin if you're cyanotic?
Blue and gray.
Blue, right? So this means that you're bluish. And what does this do to a lack of?
Oxygen.
Oxygen. So people who have COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease can't get enough oxygen, and so they tend to kind of look blue a lot of the time, right? So those are the people that have to have oxygen tanks and carry them around. And so cyanosis is a sign of a person not getting enough oxygen. Okay. We also have jaundice. And what color, if you're jaundiced, what color do you look your skin? Yellow. Okay. And this is actually a sign that your liver is not working very well, because it is not able to break down the hemoglobin and deal with the bilirubin that is accumulating in the body. So this is due to a product of hemoglobin breakdown called bilirubin. And this is breakdown occurs in the liver. So people that are having liver failure might show signs of jaundice. Yes, and so newborns typically do have jaundice, and that generally has to do with the fact that when babies are born, their hemoglobin is of the wrong kind. So fetal hemoglobin is different than adult hemoglobin. So they have to break down all their hemoglobin and replace it with adult hemoglobin. And sometimes their liver cannot metabolize all the bilirubin, and so it starts to accumulate. So this is actually common in newborns. And it just means that their liver is not able to keep up. It just generally does not mean that their livers are failing, right? And so one of the ways that you can help to increase the breakdown of bilirubin, is to put them in light. So you have light therapy. So you can take the babies outside and expose them to UV radiation, which helps to break down the bilirubin in the skin. Or if it is winter and it's too cold to like unwrap your baby and put it outside, then you put them under what are called Billy lights in the neonatal unit, or sometimes they actually send people home with Billy lights. And that is just UV lights that help to break down the bilirubin. Okay. Another example of skin color has to do with beta carotene. And these are taken or are derived from vegetables, specifically those vegetables that are orange in color. So like carrots, and also fruits like oranges. Okay. So I had a sister who was kind of addicted, this is kind of weird, but she was kind of addicted to, when we were younger, eating oranges, but also eating the orange peel. Like she would eat the whole orange peel, which is kind of good for you, but probably not in the amount of orange peel that she was eating, right? And her fingernails actually turned orange from the excessive levels of beta carotene she was taking in. So if somebody looks orange or yellowish, maybe it's just that they have a weird diet, that they're taking in excessive levels of beta carotene and it's being stored in their skin. Interestingly, birds also use this to color their feathers. And so some birds, even finches, that reddish orange feathers that they have on the top of their head can only be achieved if they have a diet that has beta carotene in it. So generally animals cannot produce beta carotene, but beta carotene is important because it is a form of vitamin A, which also is important in the ability to see. So rhodopsin is a derivative of beta carotene. Okay. So let's talk about some examples of skin cancer. So when we look at the skin cancer, we can talk about it based upon what types of cells are involved. So we have basal cell carcinoma. So this would be the cells that are in the basal layer of the epidermis, right? So they're basal cell carcinomas. And these are the most common and least deadly. And so deadly in cancer generally means how likely they are to metastasize. We also have just a second, lost my train of thought. Basal cell, squamous cell. Okay, so squamous cell carcinoma has to do with the flat cells that make up the outer epidermis, so not the basal layer. And these cells that make up the outer layer are called keratinocytes. So keratinocytes are the cells that are filled with keratin. And these are kind of like, if you catch it before it metastasizes, it can be cured. It's not that deadly, but it does metastasize more frequently than the basal cell carcinoma. Okay, so what would be the third type of skin cancer that is the most deadly because of its ability to metastasize very quickly? Does anybody know? Melanoma. So melanoma has to do with melanocytes. So it is the melanocytes that become cancerous and divide uncontrollably. And so you can always tell the difference between melanoma and the other types of skin cancer because of its dark color. So this tends to be rare overall, but it tends to also be more common in younger people. So where we see basal and squamous cell carcinoma in older people, melanoma can be kind of common in younger people. And it's the melanocytes, and this rapidly metastasizes. So this means that when it gets metastasized, this means that it goes into the circulation and could end up anywhere in your body. So it could end up in your brain, it could end up in your lungs, it could end up in your liver. So that's melanoma. Okay. So we're going to just watch a little video that talks about melanoma. It's actually a Canadian video, and it is kind of a public service announcement, but I think it's interesting.
Dear 16-year-old me. Dear 16-year-old me.
Dear 16-year-old me.
Please don't get that perm. It's not as awesome as you think it's going to be.
You have to actually practice in order to learn to play guitar.
Whiskey tastes even worse on the way up.
Dear 16-year-old me, there's going to be a new set of Star Wars movies. Don't watch them. They ruin everything.
Okay, let me see if I can get the volume up a little bit higher.
Dear 16-year-old me. This is where they took the cancer out. It was something called melanoma.
It's called malignant melanoma.
Malignant melanoma.
Malignant. That's not a very friendly word.
You'll be diagnosed when you're 28.
18.
36.
29.
22.
It's a tumor that starts in your skin cells, the cells that give your hair and skin color.
It's not just skin cancer.
Well, it is,
Well, it is.
but not just the.
Cut it out and it'll be fine kind, unfortunately.
It's the kind that you have to catch before it spreads
Because it spreads so fast.
so fast.
To places like your liver, your lungs, your brain. Yours will be a really rare kind in your left eye. And that's when you'll find out that melanoma can show up on your tongue, the palms of your hands, and the soles of your feet.
Your doctors will tell you you're lucky that you caught it early.
Yours will tell you that you need aggressive treatment.
I'll have to tell you, it might take a year of chemotherapy.
And you'll need to do some of the injections yourself.
Dear 16-year-old me,
You're doing okay.
you're strong, but there are some things I want you to know.
I wish I'd known.
That one bad sunburn before you turn 18,
Doubles your chances of developing melanoma.
that fair skin and red hair means that you're at a higher risk of getting it.
As if ginger people didn't have enough problems.
That you're at higher risk if you've got more than 50 moles.
And if you have a weakened immune system or a family history of skin cancer.
I want you to know the outlook is very good if you can catch it early. But you have less than a 10% chance of surviving more than 5 years if we don't.
Dear 16-year-old me. Spend more time with family. They mean everything.
If I had one piece of advice for you, don't start the tanning bed. I know you want a healthy glow, but it's going to double my chances of getting melanoma. Sunscreen.
Yes, I agree. It's a huge pain in the ass, but so worth it. Please.
Your skin's like an elephant. It never forgets. Dear 16-year-old me, helping spread this message is how you'll honor Glenna's memory. At 16, she's already an incredible lifeguard. She loves the sun and the beach and tanning, but she just doesn't know.
She'll be diagnosed when she's 22 and will lose her battle when she's just 26.
I want you to know, because it's melanoma that's going to take the strongest man you know, your best friend, and the love of your life.
Dear 16-year-old me.
Don't be afraid. This isn't about being afraid. I want you to be aware that melanoma is a young person's disease.
It is the second most common cancer in children and teenagers, and one of the most common in young adults.
And it can be deadly.
I want you to know you're not helpless.
This is a cancer that shows itself.
Right there on the outside of it.
Start checking your skin.
Please check.
Get to know your skin.
Get to know your skin.
Start checking your skin.
If a new mole shows up, or if when you have starts to change color, or size, or shape, or feels different. If something seems out of place, get your doctor to have a look as soon as possible.
Know what to look for and get help. These are all signs your skin could be developing cancer.
You brush your teeth every day, maybe even floss,
Okay, we both know you don't floss.
but just once a month, I want you to check.
It takes 10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Dear 16-year-old me, I do realize you're not actually going to see this, but someone else will, and it'll make a difference to them.
Dear someone else.
Dear somebody else.
If you're watching this,
Send it to a 16-year-old you care about.
Send it to anyone who is once 16, or soon will be 16.
Send this. And check yourself. Educate yourself. You can download tools and information about melanoma here.
Share this link.
Tweet this link.
Post this to your Facebook.
Okay. Any questions about that? So as a parent, you might find out that it's very hard to get your kids to believe in sunscreen. And forcing your kids to stay away from the swimming pool between like the hours of noon and 4 is very difficult as well. Okay, are there any questions about that? Okay. So here are just from your textbook some pictures of the different types of skin cancer and what they look like. Okay, so if we look at the skin, so you should be able to identify the epidermis, the papillary layer of the dermis, and then the reticular layer of the dermis, and then this hypodermis, which is the superficial fascia right there. So if we look at the structures of the dermis, we'll notice that there are other things involved. So for example, we have hair, and hair actually exists all over our body, not just on the head and our armpits and groin area. So the hair that is on our body, like on the surface of our arms, is called vellus hair, vellum hair. It's really fine. And it has a sensory function. So one of the functions of the skin is tactile sensation, and particularly to know when something is touching us, and perhaps when insects are moving across the surface of our skin. So you'll notice here that the nervous tissue is in yellow. And so you can see here that this is actually a nervous receptor, a nervous system receptor that is attached to your hair follicles. So every time your hair follicles move, it sends a signal to your sensory system that something is changed in your environment, right? We also have pressure signals. So besides the movement of the hair, you can feel light pressure, like these structures right here, or deep pressure, so this would be sensory as well. We also have associated with the hair follicles, skeletal muscles. So these muscles right here are what cause our hairs to stand on end when we are afraid. Sometimes we also get goosebumps. And goosebumps generally, they can be fear-induced, but they can also be cold-induced. And so when our hair stands on end, that is actually a mechanism to try to prevent heat loss, because if we had a lot of hair, we could fluff up. And so if you think about like when your cat or your dog is cold and they're outside, or even birds too, they fluff their feathers up, and that creates spaces of air that help to prevent heat loss. So notice all of the structures that are associated with the dermis. So we're going to talk about skin glands. And the first type of gland is called an eccrine gland. And this has another term for it, and it is called sudoriferous. Actually, there are multiple types of eccrine glands. So eccrine glands secrete watery substances. Rather than substances that are lipid-based. So this includes sweat glands. Most of what the sweat glands are secreting is water. So like 95% of your sweat is water, but we can also get rid of salt. So we have water, salt, right? So you could get rid of excess salt in your sweat. Urea, which we talked about, is an excretory function of the skin. But we also have acid, right? So the surface of the skin, the sweat, generally is acidic. So it has a pH between 4 and 6. So if our blood becomes too acidic, we can get rid of some of that acid by excreting it through the surface of the skin. We can also get rid of it by making our urine very acidic. But the acidity of the skin is actually a defense mechanism. And so sometimes it's referred to as the acid mantle, because we have things that could grow on the surface of the skin, but the acid mantle prevents that. So for example, yeast. So hopefully when if we have yeast land on our skin would be too acidic for the yeast to be able to grow. So other types of fungi, right, fungus that causes fungal infections, the acid can help protect you against that. We also have enzymes that break down bacteria. So we have good bacteria on the surface of our skin, and it's kind of interesting because we have different types of bacteria in different places. But we want to break down any bacteria that could lead to infection. Okay, so we have sweat glands. We also have apocrine glands. And apocrine glands are far less numerous than the sweat glands. And in fact, they're only associated with places where we have hair. And they actually only become active after puberty. So they become active at puberty. So the axillary regions, the armpits, and groin area. Oops, how do you spell groin? Groin area, the genital area, would have hair, and there's apocrine glands associated with them. So these apocrine glands they secrete water, but they also secrete proteins. And these proteins might be pheromones. So pheromones are chemicals that are used to communicate from one individual to the next. So people tend to have distinctive smells to them, right? And you could be attracted to somebody's distinctive smell, or you could be repelled by somebody's distinctive smell. And it is actually hypothesized that we are repelled by people who might be more genetically similar to us, which would mean that we would choose to mate with an individual that is less genetically similar so that we avoid inbreeding, and we also increase the diversity of our offspring. So we produce kind of more diverse offspring. So this might be a basis for mate choice. The problem, however, is that these proteins can be broken down by bacteria, and this is what produces body odor. So the products are broken down by bacteria, and the bacteria produce substances, and this is what causes body odor. So when you have young children, you know, they could not bathe for like a week, right? And they don't stink. But as soon as they hit puberty, they have to take a bath every day or they start to smell. And that is because of the activity of the apocrine glands. And the same thing kind of goes for older people, because your apocrine glands, after you get to a certain age and you stop, you know, you get into your 60s and 70s, you don't produce as much of this, and so that you don't smell, so you don't have to bathe as regularly. Okay, so those are the apocrine glands. We also have mammary glands. So these only become active in females, but they're also present in males. And they obviously are specialized to produce milk. So the other type of gland besides sudoriferous and eccrine that we have in our bodies are called sebaceous glands. And these produce sebum. And these are associated with hair follicles. And so what they do is that they lubricate the hair and lubricate the skin. So they have a lipid-based secretion. And they lubricate the skin. As you get older, your sebaceous glands also become less active. So like when you become older, you don't have to wash your hair as often because your sebaceous glands are less active, but also your skin dries out and cracks more. So you have dry skin as you age because of the change in the activity of the sebaceous glands. Okay. There is also a really interesting gland, and I can't remember, see where it is classified, but we have what are called the ceruminous glands. So these produce cerumen. Does anybody know where cerumen is found in your body? Ear, right? So this is the ear canal. So that yellowish substance that comes out of your ear actually has a function, right? It's produced by glands inside there, and it helps to actually catch debris. So it is kind of sticky and it's yellow and it is bitter. So if you've ever tasted your ear wax, it is bitter. And that is because it has chemicals in it that prevent infection. And so the cerumen is a defense mechanism against infection in the outer ear, the ear canal. So if we look at some pictures of these glands, right, this is the eccrine gland. And so notice you need to be able to identify the image here. So the eccrine gland has a duct, so it is an exocrine gland that goes right to the surface. So the sweat pores are not associated with hairs. The sebaceous glands are next to the hair follicle, right? And they are associated with those hair follicles, and those are the ones that get infected and cause acne. Then if we look at the structure here, this is just shows the sebaceous gland. And remember that the sebaceous gland is a holocrine gland. So that means that it produces its sebum by cell fragmentation. So it's not secreting it, but the cells are fragmented. So part of it is just pieces of cells that come out. And then your ceruminous glands are in your ear canal. One of the really interesting things about this that I learned is that there are cells in the epithelial tissue that are constantly migrating out. So the cell movement in the epithelial looks like this. So it starts here and then it moves out. Oh, this one right there. So it moves out like that. And it supposedly carries that cerumen with it. So if you use a Q-tip and you force the cerumen back into next to your eardrum, it can get stuck there. And then you might end up having to go to the doctor and having them have to use a little microscope, and they sometimes have to pull it out. Sometimes people produce excessive earwax, and it can be a plug. And so if you lose hearing like dramatically overnight, or if you like start to have pain in your ear, sometimes you go to the doctor and they'll use hot or warm water to flush out. And sometimes you can get quite big pieces of wax to come out, right, of that ear canal. Okay, so I'm going to skip over this part because we kind of already talked about the skin. So let's talk about burns. So burns are classified as their degree. So the first degree, so when you use, this actually means 1 with a little degree sign. That means first degree, right? So this is first degree, is the epidermis only. And this is associated with redness. Now you can get burns from UV radiation, so sunburns. You can get burns from heat. So let's write that up there. UV radiation, heat, but you can also get burns from other types of radiation. So you could get burns from radioactivity, right? So nuclear radioactivity. So after the atomic bomb was dropped, people had their skin sloughing off, and that would have been nuclear radiation causing that burn on their body. Okay. So then the second degree burn would be epidermis and some of dermis. This causes blistering. So you can actually get sunburns that are bad enough that you will blister. And then the third degree burns are the worst. And these are the full thickness burns. So this would be the epidermis and the dermis. And the thing about these is that they cannot regenerate. So the skin cannot regenerate on its own. So we use skin grafting. Right? So you can take skin from one part and move it. You could also take skin from other animals and move it. And now they have what is called synthetic skin, which is silicone and then collagen matrix. And so they kind of put it on there and they hope that your skin, as it repairs itself, as it builds itself, will use that synthetic skin as a graft. So one of the things about being burned that's kind of interesting is that it actually takes a lot of protein to repair the burn. So if you think about our skin has a lot of protein in it. It has keratin and it has collagen in the dermis. And so in order for a person to be able to, if you graft it, to be able to repair the damage, then you would have to give them lots of protein. So they give them high amounts of protein. Obviously, they give them fluids because they would be losing a lot of fluid across that surface. And then they have to be careful of infection. So they have to give them antibiotics. Okay. So your textbook talks a little bit about how to treat third-degree burns in particular. Okay. So let's just talk, I'm just going to talk briefly about hair and nails. So hair and nails are said to be skin derivatives. And if we look at the structure of the hair, we have two parts. We have the root and the shaft. So the root specifically contains what is called a hair matrix. It is in the root, and these are actively dividing cells. So this would be mitosis. So your hair, like your skin, is cellular in nature. So the cells in the hair matrix located in this root, sometimes this is called the bulb. You'll notice that we also have melanocytes associated with the bulb. So sometimes when you pull out hair, so think of like when you're pulling out an eyebrow hair, you sometimes notice that the bulb is dark in color, and that is because of the presence of the melanocytes, which give the hair its color. Okay? So what happens is that these cells reproduce and then they migrate to the outside. So the outer part of the shaft extends above the skin, right? So this is extends above the skin. And it's covered in a cuticle. So the cuticle is composed of cells that overlap like shingles on a roof, right? So your hair cuticle is overlapping dead cells. Dead cells. And so sometimes that can become really rough, those hair. And so oftentimes when we use conditioner, right, to make our hair smooth, what that is doing is that is making those overlapping cells kind of lay down more smoothly on the surface of the hair. So if we look at a diagram that shows this, shows the hair coming out of the epidermis, and this would be the cuticle. And so you can see that, the cuticle layers. Interestingly, the different types of hair have to do with the shape of the shaft. So like if the shaft is perfectly round, our hair is straight. If it is like this, our hair tends to be curly or kinky. So just the shape of the follicle determines whether you have straight hair or curly hair or hair that's very kinky. Okay. So interestingly, this cuticle can wear off at the ends of the hair. And then these are just keratin fibers that are extending from the ends of your hair. And what is that referred to as? Split ends, right? So when your cuticle wears away at the ends of your hair, if you haven't had it cut for a while, you'll start to get split ends, and those pieces, those are just pieces of keratin. Oops, I wanted to mention something here. So your hair has a life cycle. Okay, of like up to a week or into months, weeks to years, sorry, weeks to years. So the hair grows and then it falls out. So people that can grow really long hair on their head, they genetically are kind of predisposed to having a longer life cycle. If you're a person that cannot grow hair down to your butt, for example, if it like starts to fall out when it gets to your back, to the middle of your back, or maybe even your shoulders, that just means that the life cycle of your hair tends to be shorter, right? So it falls out and regenerates. So, for example, the life cycle of your eyebrow hair is shorter than the life cycle of your head. And so that's why it doesn't get as long. So eyebrows. So we lose hair every day. Hair is constantly falling out, and then the follicle kind of rests for a little bit, and then it starts to produce more hair. So if we talk about hair loss is called alopecia. This is where the life cycle of the hair starts to slow down and you start to lose more hair, you lose hair faster than it is replaced. So one of the things that affects this is age, right? So as you get older, your hair will begin to thin because more hair will fall out than is replaced. Another thing that can kind of strangely affect it is stress. Right? So if you're really stressed out, if you go through an extremely stressful event, you can actually lose a lot of hair. And then nutrition also affects it. So it is true that you need protein in order to build hair and other nutrients.
How come your hair falls out?
Okay, so pregnancy is interesting. So in pregnancy, one thing that happens is that the estrogen causes your hair to grow more full, right? So you actually grow, the hair grows really well when you're pregnant. And then as soon as you give birth, the estrogen levels plummet and you lose the hair. And so it's kind of depressing because when you're pregnant, you have this great head of hair, right? And then as soon as you give birth, you go through this depression and all your hair just starts to fall out, right? And your hair goes back to what it normally was. Yeah. So that just has to do with levels of estrogen. Okay.
And isn't it also genetics?
Yes, and so male pattern baldness is genetically determined, and that can sometimes affect females. And so the expression of that gene that causes male pattern baldness doesn't typically happen in females, but sometimes it can. And so there's probably more females than we know out there that have pattern baldness that we just don't see because they cover it up. Okay, so nails are the same thing, same idea. So nails, when we look at the formation of the nail, this is dead keratinized cells derived not from the hair matrix, but from the nail matrix. So the nails grow outward. Like that. And they're just modified, they're derived from the epithelial tissue. And if we look at that nail matrix, the nail matrix would be here underneath the cuticle. And those are where the cells are going to be producing the hard nail that then slowly moves outward. Okay. The nail bed, you'll notice, is highly vascular. And so that's why your nails tend to be pink. You'll notice where your nails are white, there is no blood vessel. So like right here, kind of the white part of the nail, there's fewer blood vessels there. So it is lighter in color. And notice that it's very vascular. So if you accidentally damage your nail and pull it off, it will bleed. And hopefully, if you haven't damaged the nail matrix, it will regrow. Sometimes people have problems with their toenails and they actually have the nail removed entirely. So if they have ingrown toenails that don't grow properly and are always infected, they'll go in and the doctor will just remove the nail matrix and remove that whole thing. And then the nail will not regrow. It'll just be covered with skin. Okay, so we are going to be starting on chapter 6. So this was chapter 5 in your book. So we'll start on chapter 6. on Monday. So I will see you on Friday for lab.